Hello everybody, it's Murray here from M Stewart Paintings. Welcome back to my channel. On today's acrylic landscape painting tutorial, we're going to learn how to paint reflections in water. I'm going to teach you how to block in a painting and use tones to create realism. I'm going to teach you an easy way to paint realistic reflections in your water. I'm going to give you lots of painting recipes of colours and tones so you can learn how to paint realistic things such as tree bark to give your work a really realistic look and feel. So let's get into it. So the colours we're going to use today are titanium white, cad yellow, yellow ochre, sap green, chromium oxide green, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, Prussian blue, burnt umber and black. Now all I've done is I've painted my canvas burnt sienna as always, and I've used chalk just to create an outline. We're going to have a far off sort of tree line in the background. We're going to have a beautiful lake, and we're going to push that back using tones, and then we're going to bring these trees and a riverbank forward, so it's almost like the viewer is standing on the riverbank looking off into this gorgeous landscape. So while you're jotting down the outline, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a darker tone, which is cobalt blue, just to block in my riverbank and my trees because they are going to be in the foreground. And then what we'll do is, just like always, we'll start at the back, so we'll work on the sky and the far off tree line, and we'll move our way forward towards the viewer. So all I'm doing, I'm just using some cobalt blue just to block in just where I want my trees to go, just so I know where they are, and we'll get started. So we always start at the back, so we're going to try to create a lovely blue sky, and we're going to try and reflect it onto the water almost like a mirror. So how are we going to do that? We're going to create really nice light tones for the horizon. So we're going to do that by creating a really pastel blue. So we're going to use lots of titanium white, some cobalt blue and some cerulean blue, but predominantly titanium white. So we're going to have a really whitey blue colour, and this is going to be the base of our horizon. So the sky is always lighter at the bottom and it gets darker in tone as you move up towards the top of the painting. So all we're going to do is we're going to create a lovely pastel tone. And then to get a little bit more blue and a bit darker, we're just going to add a tiny bit more cerulean blue and a bit more cobalt blue. Still plenty of whites, but just a bit more blues into our mix. And we're just going to get a bit darker. So look, it's just a bit more blue. And all we're going to do is we're just going to block in our painting. Now don't worry if you paint over your trees or you have any streaks or anything, just as usual. We're just trying to block it in, and we're just trying to sort of match all the colours of where we want things to be. So all we're doing is just using a big brush. We're just blocking everything in. Don't worry if it's scruffy or messy. We'll come back and we'll rework everything. We just want to get the colours down, and we just want to block everything in. So all we're doing is we've done our sky, we're going to match that in the water. So think of a mirror. We're going to have the lighter tone first, so it's just plenty of white, cerulean blue and cobalt blue, but predominantly white, and we're just going to have that really light colour just to match the sky at the base. And then we're going to get darker by adding more cerulean blue and cobalt blue to our mix. Still plenty of white, we still want to make it really pastel. And all we're going to do is just block as much as we can in. So just using a big brush, as I say, don't worry if it's scruffy or streaky. Don't worry if you have bits of the burnt sienna shining through. We will go over everything. We just want to make sure we've got a really nice sort of composition on the go. We want to create a nice realistic landscape. We want to create realism in our work. So hopefully just by creating a really nice composition, as in the way it looks, and also with the tones, we can create the realism. So we want to push that tree line far back because we want to be standing in the foreground. So we want to create a far off distance background. So we're going to do that by using blues. So we're going to take some cobalt blue, and we're going to add a little bit of sap green to it. A little bit of black, so we're just going to take a bit of black, so cobalt blue predominantly, and sap green, just a little bit of green into it, and a little bit of black, and we should get this lovely sort of musty dark blue. And it's not too dark because it's cobalt blue. Cobalt blue is very bright, And what we're going to do, we're just going to block in our tree line. Now what we're doing is we're painting the underpainting. Now this is going to be sort of the dark shadow tone where we're going to put all the shadows and highlights on top. But we want to have a base and we want to make it quite blue, because what it's doing is picking up the sky colour. So by adding lots of cobalt blue, a little bit of sap green just to give it a little bit of tree colour, and some black. Oops, I put a bit too much black in, so we'll just add some white just to make it a little bit less dark. So cobalt blue, sap green, and a little bit of black. If you put too much black in, just add a little bit of white just to bring it back. There we go. Just mix it back in. And if it's a shade lighter or darker, just make sure you go over all of it, just so it all matches in tone. As I say, acrylics always dry darker, so even if you do a lighter tone, just go over it just so it matches. And what we're trying to do is keep it quite bobbly, because these are all sort of the heads of trees. And by using that sort of bluey green colour, what it does is it just pushes it back and it brings our trees forward towards the viewer because they are darker in tone. So it's a really easy trick. By using more sort of saturated blues, you can push things back. And by having darker tones in the near foreground, you can bring things forward that look like you're right next to the viewer. So all we're doing, look, we're just creating a mirror. So whatever shapes I've created in the tree line, I'm trying to match them in the water below. And just by using this blue, it just gives the illusion of the trees reflecting onto the water. So easy trick, really easy landscape today. So just block it in the best you can and we should have created a mirror effect in our work. And then once you're happy with it and it's all blocked in, we'll start working on all the detail. So we've got this lovely reflection now, and we've got this really nice realistic tones, but we just want to neaten everything up before we start putting all the detail on. So this is how you can make this the light horizon colour. It's just plenty of titanium white, a little bit of cerulean blue and a little bit of cobalt blue, but predominantly titanium white. And you should get this colour that I've got to the left of it, which is pre-mixed, because I'm lazy and I buy all these colours pre-mixed, but I want to show you how you can make this really realistic tone. And what this is the sort of shiny bit of the water which matches the base of the horizon on your sky. So all we're going to do, look, now we can put a second coat of paint on. We're going to make everything look much more fancy and posh. So we're going to put the lighter tone just up to that tree line in the reflection. And this could be nice and shimmering to create the realism in our water. And while we've got that colour, we're going to put that in at the horizon. And as I keep saying to you, we want to make the horizon not only to make our tree line stand out by making the horizon lighter, just to give our work a more 3D effect by using a lighter tone that makes the tree line stand out, but also to create realism by having a lighter shade of blue at the base of the horizon, and then by adding more cerulean blue and cobalt blue to our mix. The great thing about cerulean blue is it's more sort of turquoisey and cobalt blue is more cooler, but by mixing the two and plenty of titanium white, you get this gorgeous realistic sky colour. So it's a really good recipe. I thought I'd share some of my recipes for paints to how to make a really realistic sky colour. And all we're doing is we're just blending it into the previous tone, that lighter shade. It just creates a nice transition in your sky and just creates a realistic sky. Look, and we're going to match that in the water. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a mirror effect. So all we're doing, if you imagine the water is like a big mirror, all we're doing is just trying to match it. And you can add a little bit more cobalt blue and a little bit of cerulean blue, but more cobalt blue, just a little bit, because it's a bit cooler than the cerulean blue. Still plenty of white, and just at the bottom you can just make it a little bit more cooler. So look at the cobalt blue, it's really cool, it's a lot darker. So at the bottom you can just make it a little bit cooler, and just like as always, we always darken up our corners. Just by making the bottom a little bit darker, we'll just mix the two tones in a minute. We'll go back to the previous tone and we'll just make it a little bit lighter by adding some white to that mix. So we're just going to add a little bit of white to it. We'll just bridge the two tones together, and then what that does, again, it just makes it look, because it's coming towards the viewer, it's getting darker, it's less sunlight Obviously you've got the shade, we've got these dark trees, you're standing on the riverbank. Just again, just gives a nice transition into your water and just makes it look more realistic. It's an easy trick. All these paint recipes, as I keep saying to you, I buy a lot of my paints pre-mixed, but you don't need lots and lots of colours when you first start. I know it's expensive, especially if you're learning, so I'm hopefully trying to give you lots of recipes that will save you a lot of money, and you can make all these colours at home. And by making your colours as well, they look more real, they look more realistic. So we've got this lovely gradient in our sky and our water. Once you're happy and you're dry, if you just measure a straight line, I am using chalk. So this is why I paint my canvas a dark colour, and this is why I always use chalk. Because the great thing about chalk is it doesn't leave any marks, you can just paint straight over it, but also you can move things about. So here I'm just creating a straight line, just so I've got a nice straight horizon, and we're going to create the illusion. I'm just going to put where my trees were. We're going to create the illusion of reflections, because a lot of people have been asking me, because I paint a lot of water, how to paint reflections in water. And I thought, why not combine two ideas? A lot of people have been asking how to paint trees, so I thought, why not create a composition where we can have both. So we're going to create some shadows for our trees first. So we're going to put the shadows on first, and then we're going to put the highlights over the top. So we're going to get some blue and black to create Prussian blue, and we're going to add some burnt umber to that mix and a little bit of sap green. So cobalt blue, burnt umber, some black and some sap green to create a really dark, shadowy, dark bluey colour. And this musty dark shadow tone, what we're going to do is we're going to leave lots of gaps in our underpainting in that lovely cool blue. So I'm leaving plenty of gaps, and we're going to create the illusion of foliage. So we're going to create the illusion of bushes and trees. So by leaving gaps, if I zoom in a little bit for you, just like when we do things like the waves in the previous tutorials, by leaving the underpainting, what we're going to do is we're going to try to create realism using tones. And by leaving lots of gaps, we're going to try to create the illusion of branches and trees and tree trunks and all that good stuff. And we're going to try to create reflections that match. So all we're doing first, we're just putting on the darks first, and then we're going to start putting the highlights on the top. So all I'm doing, I'm just trying to create the illusion, I'm just creating splats to create the illusion of branches. Now if you imagine all the riverbank is going to have the most shadows, and just like always, I want to darken up the edges of either side because I want you to focus down the middle. So by darkening up the edges, I want to get you to focus forward. So all I'm doing, if I've created it on the going upwards, I'm just going to create it going downwards. So all I'm going to do is try to mirror what I've just created below in the water, just to create the same sort of patterns and shapes. Now don't worry if they're not exact. It's very, very hard to almost paint upside down. But if you can just try to sort of mirror, if you go up high on one bit, just go down below, and just sort of bring your paintbrush down. And as you can see, look, you can go over the chalk, it leaves no marks. That's what's great about chalk. You're not going to get any dirty pencil marks. So all we're doing, just on that riverbank, I'm just trying to create more of a shadow, so there's a little bit of a divide, so you know which bit's a reflection and which bit is the tree. And we're just trying to create the illusion of shadows. So when you have branches hanging over on the bank and stuff, it casts a shadow underneath it. Now you can use a spiky brush, like you can use a weathered old brush and load up your paint if you choose to. I'm just using a round-headed brush, but you can use a spiky brush just to cheat and to get more texture. Now, if you add a bit of burnt umber and you add a bit of yellow ochre to your burnt umber, so that is a dark yellow. Now, yellow ochre, if you haven't got that at home, you can make that with yellow and purple. So, burnt umber, yellow ochre, and a little bit of sap green, and still a little bit of cobalt blue because we want to push that back. So we use blues to push it back into the background. So once my hand comes out of the way, so we've got this greeny orange colour. Now I added a tiny bit too much black here, I was a bit heavy handed, so just add a tiny bit of black, but I've just got to put some more paint in the mix because the black basically takes it over. So all I'm doing is adding burnt umber and yellow ochre, a little bit of black, some sap green, and some cobalt blue, just till I get this really nice yellowy green colour, this very dark earthy tone. And what that is the shadow colour in between, not the really dark bluey blacks that we've just put in. This is a colour that's a little bit brighter, a little less harsh, and these are all the bits of shadows that are still getting a bit of light. So again, we put the darkest on first, and then we're using this tone, which is sort of a bridge tone. So we've got this browny dark yellowy green, but we're doing the exact same tricks. We're leaving gaps in the underpainting, and whatever we've done going upwards or downwards, we're just trying to mirror. So if I create a lot of texture in one area of the painting, I want to reflect that downwards underneath it, just so it looks like a mirror. And at this stage, it looks really scruffy, it looks really basic, but that is all the leap of faith. So look, we're going to darken up the edges, just so you again focus down the middle. So all we're doing, we're just putting all the shadows on first, and then we're going to put all the highlights over the top and make it all come together. So we're going to take some of this green, which is it's called chromium oxide green, and I'm going to show you how to make it if you don't have it. It's basically sap green and cobalt blue. So sap green and cobalt blue, and you can add a little bit of yellow. So sap green, cobalt blue, and a tiny bit of yellow, and you should get it. You can add a tiny bit of white, so I've just added a little bit of white just to try and match it, but just by adding a little bit of yellow just to brighten it up. It's basically a saturated bright green, but it's kind of like in between a lime, which is incredibly bright, and an olive. If you imagine them, I always think of everything food related. So if you think of an olive, so you can add a little bit of yellow ochre to this colour, and a little bit of cobalt blue. So green, yellow ochre, and a bit of cobalt blue, and a tiny bit of yellow if you want to. But we still want it very bluey. And what we're going to do, we're going to start adding the highlights. Now, just like before, we're going to try and mirror it in the reflection. But now we've got that really nice bluey base colour, and now we've got these really dark shadow colours. We're going to leave gaps, and we're going to try to create texture. So by leaving gaps, and just by leaving that lovely blue colour, and just by leaving lots of the shadow colour, and trying to mirror whatever I do in the top part, I want to try and mirror underneath on our reflection. We can create the illusion of realistic trees, and we can create realistic reflections in our water, just to create texture, just by cheating, by doing that lovely blue tone, and then by using the shadows, and then by using these highlights over the top. What it does is it just creates the illusion of texture. So I want on the left side to be a bit darker than I do on the right side. I'm going to just do two different shades. I think on the left we'll have that bank in the shade, and we'll have the right bank in the sunlight. So because we want to have this one in the sunlight, we're going to mix some yellow ochre into our green. So we've got green, yellow ochre, and cobalt blue, but predominantly yellow ochre. And we're just going to create some highlights on the tips just to give it a little bit of definition. And again, we're going to try to have your tree line not so flat, so try to make it quite bumpy, and if you do it again, try to match it on your reflection. And just by making it bumpy, what it does, it just makes it look like certain trees are bigger than others, and again it just creates more realism by just having brighter highlights that don't all match in height, and some are bigger than others, and again it just creates more realistic. But can you see it's the underpainting, that blue tone that we used. That blue tone is what tricks the eye and gives it that realism. Even though we're not doing a detailed painting today, we're just doing a 40-minute easy tutorial, it's the tones that tricks the viewer's eyes. Now what you can do is just take pure yellow ochre now. You can even add a tiny bit of cad yellow to it just to make it a very bright highlight. And just on the very tips of some of your tree lines, because these are the bits that are getting the most sunlight, you can just add really bright highlights just at the very tops. But just whatever you do, it's a bit too bright there, if you do a bright highlight like I'm doing now, make sure you match it in the water just to create the realism. So look, if I do a bright highlight here, I've got to match it here. Easy peasy, it's super easy technique. So think whatever you do above in the tree line, just make sure you match it in the water. So if you have a really bright highlight somewhere, just try to match it. And what that does is, again, it just tricks the eye and just creates the realism. So look, if you use a little bit of cad yellow to your yellow ochre, just to make it look a little bit brighter. And again, it's just to give some definition. You've got lots of texture. Just by having some bright highlights and some dark shadows, it just gives texture. So if we zoom out, look how realistic that looks. And again, it's not from any detail, it's just from the tones. So I'm going to teach you a really easy trick now. We're going to take the horizon color, which was titanium white and cerulean blue and cobalt blue, and I'm going to use a flat-headed paintbrush, and all I'm going to do is poke some holes in my reflection. But by using a flat-headed brush, I can keep those lines straight, and what that does is it creates the ripple effect in our water. So a super easy cheat to create realism in your reflections in your water is to use the water color or sky color and poke some holes in your water. Now if it's a really light color, you can add a little bit more white. You can even add some ripples in your water. Now I'm not going to go too ripply because it's a nice flat tranquil water. I want to make it nice and peaceful for everyone. I don't want it to be too choppy. But you can see here, if I just show you, it's you can create ripples in your water. So if you chose to, you could add something like a duck or a swan or something, and you can add ripples. So it's just showing you by using a flat brush how easy that is to do. Now I'm going to teach you how to paint realistic trees. So we're going to take some black, some cobalt blue, a little bit of burnt umber, and some sap green, but predominantly black. But we're adding these colours just to make it off black so it's not too cartoony. And by using a flat brush, you can get nice straight lines. And all I'm going to do is just block in these trees. So I'm going to create a tree trunk. Now remember, your tree trunk is always wider at the base of your tree, at the trunk, at the bottom, than it is at the top. So if you ever make your tree a bit too big at the top, just go down and make your booty of the tree, the base of it, a little bit darker. Now the reason we've saved our darkest tones to the foreground is we want to push that far off riverbank and our reflections back. So we're going to use darker tones to bring our riverbank and everything forwards. So by using the black and then mixing some of the dark brown and the blue and the green into it, we're trying to make this really dark shadow tone. So this, if you imagine you're standing on the riverbank looking out into this beautiful landscape, and it's all in the shade because you're under the trees. So what we're trying to do is match that with the tones and create a really dark tone. So just use a flat brush, you can get nice straight edges, and you can just create lovely trees. So don't worry if you make any mistakes, and don't worry if you have any chalk or burnt sienna. We can always just go around them later and just neaten them up. So if you have any chalk or burnt sienna, you can always just paint around it, or you can always just, as I show you later on, you can always just mix the tones that we use for the foliage in the background, and you can just quickly add it in and no one will notice. Easy trick. So when you're happy with it and you've got a nice dark tree line, we'll start adding some detail over the top. Now if you can dry your work, just because we don't want to paint over black, it will just mix and create a musty colour, because we want to add some highlights. So we're going to use the flat brush again, so the flat headed brush, and we're going to mix some white and some cobalt blue. So we got some white, cobalt blue and a little bit of black, and we're going to create a little bit of brown as well. We're going to create a sort of warm grey, so that's why I'm adding a little bit of blue and a little bit of brown. We're just going to create this lovely sort of warm bluey grey, and just by adding a little bit of brown, it just gives it that earthy tone, just makes it look really realistic. And all we're going to do, we're going to load up our flat-headed brush, and we're just going to create the illusion of bark. So if all we're going to do is I'm going to create straight lines coming down, I'm going to leave gaps just like we did in the foliage in the far distance. We're going to leave plenty of the underpainting, and by using a flat-headed brush I'm going to leave gaps and I'm going to create the illusion of bark. So all I'm doing, I'm leaving some gaps. I'm going to outline the edges just because that's the bit going to get the sunlight. So I'm just going to outline the whole edge of our tree. So look, I've outlined it, and then I've just left gaps. I've just created sort of shapes. So if I zoom in just so it's a bit easier for you, so we're going to load up our flat brush. So watch, I'm going to just come down, I'm going to create an outline on the far edge. So this edge is getting all the sunlight, so that's why it's got a lovely bright edge, and it sort of matches in tone with our sky. And then all I'm going to do, look, I'm just leaving gaps, but just coming down and just creating sort of the illusion of bark just by leaving the dark tone to create the shadow effect. So look at that, looks like a photo, and it's just easy trick. It's by using the tones. It's by keep trying to emphasize with people. As you get better, like obviously we're doing these little tutorials in 40 minutes and stuff, but say you were gonna just spend 2-3 hours on this painting, you could get everything photorealistic. But if you work on the tones, that's the thing that will create the realism. And then as your drawing gets better and you take more time with your work, you can create super realism, like hyper realistic work, as I say, just by taking your time. But if you work on tones, you can apply this to anything. So look, just create realistic bark and give it that 3D texture just by leaving gaps, and that creates the look of a haggard old tree, a bit like me. So I'm going to get some cobalt blue and a little bit of sap green and black to that mix. So cobalt blue, sap green and black, a little bit of white, and all I'm going to do is just paint in some of the bits of foliage that's sticking out where we've got some of the burnt sienna and chalk. All I'm doing is just mixing up that short shadow colour that we had, and I'm just going around our trees and I'm just filling in the blanks basically, and just filling in. That's the great thing about using a dark colour on your canvas. You can see where you've missed. It's a really handy trick. So just by painting your canvas, as I say, you don't have to paint it burnt sienna. I just find it works for me because just like now I can see where I've missed, and I can just go around areas and fix them. And if I ever, you'll see a little bit later on in the video, I make a boo-boo, I make a mistake, and I have to wipe away a bit of paint. And sometimes what happens is you can see the burnt sienna, so you can see where you've missed and where you have to rework. Now while I've got that colour, I'm just going to create sort of dots, and as I was saying to you earlier, just trying to make the tops of the trees a little less flat and a little bit more tree-like, and I'm just going to try to match that in the reflection below. So I'm just trying to make everything look bumpy and less flat, just also to make it just look more realistic. Now if you haven't liked and subscribed, please do so. I'm sorry the tutorials have been a bit sporadic of lately. I've had a terrible neck injury for the last 3 months. So I have weeks where I feel really good and I can paint lots, and I have other weeks where I can barely paint at all because my neck hurts so much. So sorry if some weeks there's 2 videos and then there's 3 weeks to another, but it just depends when I've had a bad time with my neck. So there we go. So I'm going to mix some of the black and brown and dark green, and I'm just going to edge the left hand side because this side's going to be in the dark because it's getting more shadow. And I'm just, where that paint's dried a bit flat, I'm just going to create some texture on the riverbank and do the same on this tree. So I'm just making one edge a lot darker. We've got one edge in the sun, we've got one edge in the dark, and of course we're going to darken up our corners. So it's just nice and dark before we put all the highlights on top. So that's the great thing about a flat brush, you can just outline things. So all I'm doing is just coming down. It's almost like using a fine liner because the edge is so fine It's like a knife. It's really, really sharp. You can really easily outline things, so it's really good for bark and trees. You can emphasize shadows and you can highlight things. So we're trying to make our tree look 3D. So that looks cool. So I'm going to get some green and black. So I'm going to mix a really dark shadow color. So green and black. And I'm going to try to create some foliage and just some long grass. A little bit of cobalt blue, why not? Just on our riverbank, just so it doesn't look so flat and boring. So I'm just going to create some foliage. Now I went a bit overboard here and I started painting lots of trees and shrubs, and as I always say to you, sometimes with painting you take a step back and it doesn't look as good as what you can see when you're up close with it. So I always say to people, paint a little bit of your work and then just take a step back and see if you like it or you don't like it. Now the great thing about acrylics, and the great way I'm trying to teach you with the tutorials, if you dry your work at each stage, if you make a boo-boo or a mistake like I do in a minute, you can just wipe it out. So I would copy this bit, but I wouldn't copy from now. I wouldn't copy this bit here, this tree here, this little bush. I don't think it looks very nice. It's up to you. If someone can add a bush, I thought, why not? But I think it just looks a bit weird. And I went a bit over the top in a minute. So hang tight from painting all these little bushes just yet, because I think just having a bit of grass and foliage would be enough. I think it's just a bit too much having all these bushes. You do, funny enough, in Britain here, I don't know about where you guys live, you do get all these sort of little trees and sort of bushes and foliage at the edge of riverbanks, but I just thought it was a bit taking your eye off my hedge in the background. So all you do to create highlights, we do the shadow color first, and then you put the greens and yellow ochres on top. So just like we did with the far off hedge line, I'm just trying to create a bit of sunlight on the right hand side just to match it, so it looks like the sun is coming from the left, I guess, coming down to the right. But as I say, I don't really like the even though I'm trying to add some texture and stuff, I don't really like it. I think it looks a bit rubbish. So the great thing about, as I say, if you've been just working each stage and you literally dry your work at each stage, if you make a mistake and you go a bit OTT like I'm doing now, you can just rub it out. So you can use a baby wipe, or you can just dip a little bit of kitchen roll in some water, and where acrylics dry so quickly, if you've been drying it with a hairdryer at each stage, you can just dry it. So look, to add highlights, you can just create white, green and yellow. Now I add a highlight here. As I say, please don't paint this bit. I just thought I'd leave it in because I'm trying to show people how everyone makes mistakes. Sometimes what you see in your mind doesn't quite work when you go to paint, and sometimes the light doesn't match, or it's just a bit too bright, or it takes away from something. So it's a good rule of thumb to, as I keep saying to you, step back from your work, take a few steps back, because I think it's just a bit too bright. The highlights are just a bit too bright. I didn't like it. I think eventually I'll go back and paint a duck or something in the water. But I think this little tree here, this little branch in the sun, sort of takes away the view of my beautiful far off reflections. So I think what I'm going to do is just wipe it away. See you later, hasta la vista. But as I say, I wanted to leave it in there just to show people, if you've just been drying your work, you can just get a baby wipe and you can just go over areas, look, and you can just use a baby wipe and just wipe it away. If you get a smear or anything like that from the green or the yellow because the paint is wet, just get a fresh one and just wipe it again. So look, just wipe it and we'll do it. Now I like the one on the left, so we're going to keep that, and I'm just going to get some sap green and a little bit of black, and I'm just going to edge this bit of grass, And I'm just going to make it more grass-like. So all I'm going to do is just make it a bit more bubbly, just like we did with the far-off foliage. I'm just going to darken up this area because obviously we've got the tree. So there we go, that looks a bit more realistic. It looks a bit better. And because it hasn't got a little tree, it's not taking your eye off the reflection. So we'll just add a tiny one and we'll just make it a little bit bobbly. Just a tiny bit. Just so it doesn't look so flat. There we go. That's cool. And it doesn't take your eyes away. So look, that is starting to look incredibly realistic. But I think I want to make my tree a bit lighter. Now it's dried. As I keep saying to you, acrylics dry very, very dark. So we're going to take some of that blue, which was cobalt blue, cerulean blue, plenty of white. We're going to add a bit of yellow ochre to that mix and a tiny bit of burnt umber. And we're going to create a highlight for our tree bark. So we're going to do the exact same trick. I'm going to outline it first with this bright highlight. So I'm just going to outline my tree and I'm just going to leave plenty of gaps. So as I keep saying, acrylics dry very, very dark, and if you're using things like black, sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming. It's a very dark, shadowy day here in London. It's a very wet, cloudy day as usual, so the lighting on the video might be a bit different to what I'm seeing in front of me. But all I'm doing, I'm just using a bright highlight. I'm leaving plenty of gaps in the underpainting like usual. So look, just to create more realism and just create a more striking tree. So again, we're going to highlight one side, so we're going to highlight the right hand side, and we're going to have the left side being in the shade. I'm going to try to create realism by using the tones and using the highlights. Now that highlight is fantastic, but it's a bit bright to go from a really super bright highlight to a really, really dark shadow in the black. So as I keep trying to teach you, a great way to do to create realism is have a bridge tone, have a tone in between. So by adding a little bit of blue to our mix and a tiny bit of burnt umber to our mix, we can add just a little bit darker saturated blue color. And all you do, a tiny bit of sap green, just a tiny bit, and a tiny bit of yellow ochre. There we go. Shove it all together. What you can do is just between the black and that really powerful highlight, you can just go up through the middle, just do the exact same technique. Because there's not a really, really bright highlight one side and a really, really dark shadow in the black the other side, that highlight sort of bridges the two, as you can see here. And it just makes the tree look more three-dimensional, more rounded, and it just makes it look more realistic. So a really easy recipe to create realistic bark by creating a highlight on one edge, a medium tone in the middle, and a dark tone on the other edge. So I've signed her in the left hand side. You've learned how to do a realistic gradient in your sky as you get darker as you move away from the horizon and you reflect that into your water. You've learned how to paint reflections. So you've learned how to paint realistic tree foliage in the background by using shadows and highlights. You've even used a flat brush to create ripples in your water and in your painted reflections. You've learned how to keep your darkest darks to bring the riverbank forward and use your lighter tones to push that foliage back, and you've learned a recipe how to paint realistic trees and bark. So please send your versions of my tutorials to @M Stewart Paintings on Instagram. You can always tag me or DM me, and please keep liking and subscribing. The channel is doing fantastic. I'm really, really happy with everyone's tutorials and the support, so thank you so much. As I say, hopefully my net gets a little bit better and I can create more tutorials for you guys. So take care of yourself, guys, and see you soon for the next tutorial. See you later. Bye.